Well, good morning and welcome back to Musings of a Texas Preacher Man. I'm Scott Fisher and I'm glad you've chosen to study with me this morning. Last week we began looking at the subject of the blood of Abel, the shedding of innocent blood by Israel and martyr vindication. Today we're going to be continuing to unpack the prophetic and eschatological nature of the vindication of the blood of the martyrs, Abel's blood being the first. Beginning in Deuteronomy chapter 32, the Song of Moses, we're introduced to a pattern that takes place throughout the Old Testament prophets and into the New Testament. Understanding this pattern is critical for biblical interpretation. In Deuteronomy chapter 32, verses 28 to 33, God identifies Israel, his own people, as his enemy, and he calls them Sodom and Gomorrah. Now let's look at it. Deuteronomy 32, verses 28 to 33. For they are a nation lacking in counsel, and there's no understanding in them. Would that they were wise, that they understood this, that they would discern their future, or if you check the margin in the New American Standard Bible, it says, or their latter end. How could one chase 1,000 and two put 10,000 to flight, unless their rock had sold them and the Lord had given them up? Now this is a direct reference to the blessings and cursings of Deuteronomy chapter 28. In verse 7 of Deuteronomy 28, under the blessings, he stated, the Lord shall cause your enemies who rise up against you to be defeated before you. They will come out against you one way and flee before you 7 ways. Now that's the blessing. Then in verse 25, under the cursings, he says, the Lord shall cause you to be defeated before your enemies. You'll go out one way against them, but you will flee 7 ways before them, and you'll be an example of terror to all the kingdoms of the earth. His point in Deuteronomy chapter 32:30 is that they are being disproportionately routed by their enemy, and how could this be if they're under the blessing? The only way it could happen is if their rock had given them up. Verse 31 of Deuteronomy chapter 32. Indeed, their rock is not like our rock. Even our enemies themselves judge this. For their vine is from the vine of Sodom and from the fields of Gomorrah. Their grapes are grapes of poison, their clusters bitter. Now here's the first reference identifying Jerusalem as Sodom and Gomorrah. Their fruit is poisonous. Instead of life, it's killing them. Verse 33, their wine is the venom of serpents and the deadly poison of cobras. In this verse, their wine is the deadly venom of serpents is another way of saying this is that their doctrine is the doctrine of demons. Their false teaching that they are trusting in is killing them. Now, one other important point from Deuteronomy chapter 32 is how it begins. Notice verses 1 through 5. Now, this is a song that Moses was instructed by God to compose and to teach to the children of Israel. It was to be passed down throughout their generations to serve as a witness against them. And we pick it up in verse 1. Give ear, O heavens, and let me speak, and let the earth hear the words of my mouth. Now notice, he addresses them, give ear, O heavens, and let the earth hear the words of my mouth. Heaven and earth. This principle continues throughout the Old Testament prophets and into the New Testament. He's talking to Old Covenant Israel and addresses them as heaven and earth. Just keep that truth in your mind because we'll be seeing it a lot as we go forward. Verse 2, let my teaching drop as the rain, my speech distill as the dew, as the droplets on the fresh grass, and as the showers on the herb. For I proclaim the name of the Lord, ascribe greatness to our God, the rock. His work is perfect, for all his ways are just, a God of faithfulness without injustice, righteous and upright is he. Now remember that Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 identified the rock that followed the children of Israel in the wilderness as Christ. Verse 5, they've acted corruptly toward him. They are not his children because of their defect, but are a perverse and crooked generation. Now here is the prophetic judgment against apostate Israel. The declaration of God regarding their end being given to them at their beginning, the final words of Moses to them as they cross over into the promised land. Now, I've said for years, if there were no other book in the Bible but Isaiah, it would be enough. Let's look at the opening verses of Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 1. We'll pick it up at verse 2. Listen, O heavens, and hear, O earth, for the Lord speaks. Sons I have reared and brought up, but they have revolted against me. Now notice again, in a prophecy against the nation of Israel, the Lord addresses it to heaven and earth. And then he begins to prophesy against their apostasy. Verse 3, an ox knows its owner and a donkey its master's manger, but Israel does not know, my people do not understand. Alas, sinful nation, weighed down, people weighed down with iniquity, offspring of evildoers, sons who act corruptly, they have abandoned the Lord. They have despised the Holy One of Israel. They have turned away from him. It's a prophecy of their latter end, when they will reject Jesus as Messiah, the Holy One of Israel. Where will you be stricken again? Verse 5, as you continue in your rebellion. The whole head is sick and the whole heart is faint. Now this is the covenantal judgments that are coming against their apostasy over the course of their entire history. And the Lord's saying to them, where else can I strike you that I haven't already struck you? From the sole of the foot even to the head, there's nothing sound in it, only bruises, welts, and raw wounds, not pressed out or bandaged, nor softened with oil. Your land is desolate. Your cities are burned with fire. Your fields, strangers are devouring them in your presence. It is desolation, as overthrown by strangers. The daughter of Zion is left like a shelter in a vineyard, like a watchman's hut in a cucumber field, like a besieged city. Unless the Lord of hosts had left us a few survivors, we would be like Sodom. We would be like Gomorrah. And once again, the apostate nation, the apostate city, is referred to as Sodom and Gomorrah. Verse 10, hear the word of the Lord, you rulers of Sodom. Give ear to the instruction of our God. You people of Gomorrah. The rulers of Sodom are the religious leaders, the chief priests, the Pharisees, and the scribes. Now, we go to Jeremiah chapter 23, which is also a messianic prophecy of judgment against the apostates at the time of Messiah. And it's very similar in tone to Jesus' rebuke of the Pharisees in Matthew chapter 23. Now, today we're just going to look at two verses from Jeremiah 23 for the sake of time. We're going to look at verses 13 and 14. Moreover, among the prophets of Samaria, I saw an offensive thing. They prophesied by Baal and led my people astray. Also among the prophets of Jerusalem, I've seen a horrible thing. The committing of adultery and walking in falsehood, and they strengthen the hands of evildoers, so that no one has turned back from his wickedness. All of them have become to me like Sodom, and her inhabitants like Gomorrah. And once again, the apostates of Israel at the time of Messiah are referred to as Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, I believe all of the New Testament was completely written prior to 70 AD, including the book of Revelation. I believe the book of Revelation is a prophecy concerning the coming destruction of Jerusalem and the old covenantal system, the temple, the priesthood, and everything associated with it in the 70 AD destruction of Jerusalem prophesied by Jesus in the Olivet Discourse and other parables that he told. Now, about 5 years ago, as I was teaching through the book of Revelation, this came alive for me, and I began to see and understand what was taking place. The dots began to be connected for me. It was in Revelation chapter 11, verse 8. And their dead bodies will lie in the street of the great city, which is mystically called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. Now here, John speaks of the great city, which is Jerusalem, and which is mystically called Sodom and Egypt, where also their Lord was crucified. There can be no doubt about it. Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem. And the great city, the holy city, is called by the name of Old Testament enemies of God, Sodom and Egypt. And he goes on through the book. The Babylon of Revelation is also Jerusalem. She, Jerusalem, is the great harlot, the adulterous wife. Verse 21, how the faithful city has become a harlot. Now listen, Jerusalem is the only city in Scripture referred to as the faithful city, and also the only city referred to as a harlot. She who was full of justice, righteousness once lodged in her, but now murderers. Now here is Isaiah's first reference to Jerusalem's sin of the shedding of innocent blood. Now the city is full of murderers. Remember what Jesus said in Matthew 23 and Luke 13. We're going to look at it in Luke 13, beginning at verse 33. Nevertheless, I must journey on today and tomorrow and the next day. For it cannot be that a prophet would perish outside of Jerusalem. O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together, just as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you would not have it. Behold, your house is left to you desolate. That's Jesus's prophecy of the coming destruction of Jerusalem that would take place in 70 AD. And this ties exactly together with what we're reading in Isaiah chapter 1, verse 22 now. Your silver has become dross, your drink diluted with water. All right, so silver becoming dross means a mixture of metals. And that's what the smelterer does. He smelts the metals, he melts them down and bubbles off the dross. What God's saying to Israel is you've become a mixed metal. You're not pure. Your drink has become diluted with water. Now, I know we talk about alcohol, however you feel about that, but listen, the bottom line is if you go in to buy a drink and that drink is diluted with water, no matter what the drink is, whether it's liquor or whether it's wine or whether it's soda, the more water that's added to it, the less pure the drink becomes. And that's what God's saying about Israel. They are diluted with water. Verse 23, your rulers are rebels and the companions of thieves. Everyone loves a bribe and chases after rewards. They do not defend the orphan, nor does the widow's plea come before them. Now remember, again, James said this is true and undefiled religion, to care for the widows and orphans. And at that point in time, the true religion had become defiled. It was distorted. perverted. They were greedy, and everyone was out for gain. Verse 24, therefore the Lord God of hosts, the mighty one of Israel, declares, I will be relieved of my adversaries and avenge myself on my foes. Now remember our study from yesterday. God called Jerusalem Sodom, Egypt, and Babylon. And here in Isaiah chapter 1, he calls them his adversaries and his foes. And notice what he says here. I will avenge myself on my foes. This is the promised vengeance, what Jesus called the days of vengeance in Luke 21, verse 20. Now, verse 25, I will also turn my hand against you and will smelt away your dross as with lye and will remove all your alloy. Then I will restore your judges as at first and your counselors as at the beginning. After that, you will be called a city of righteousness, a faithful city. Now, what's critical to understand here is that the city of Jerusalem is going to be destroyed, and simultaneously, the heavenly Jerusalem will come down out of heaven. This is the kingdom. This is the new covenant. And it's fully realized simultaneously with the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. Verse 27, Zion will be redeemed with justice, and her repentant ones with righteousness. But transgressors and sinners will be crushed together, and those who forsake the Lord will come to an end. So again, we have this pattern of simultaneous salvation and destruction. Salvation for the righteous remnant, the repentant ones. Destruction for the sinners and transgressors, those who forsake the Lord. Verse 29, surely you will be ashamed of the oaks which you have desired, and you will be embarrassed at the gardens which you have chosen, for you will be like an oak whose leaf fades away, or as a garden that has no water. The strong man will become tender, his work also a spark, thus they shall both burn together, and there will be none to quench them. Now, that's speaking of this prophetic future end of the old covenantal system, the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the old covenantal system, the destruction of the temple, which would happen just as Jesus prophesied in 70 AD. Now, Isaiah then continues to define with specificity this prophecy of Israel's last days. And we pick it up in Isaiah chapter 2. Now, this morning we're going to conclude here with verses 1 through 3, but we're going to come right back tomorrow morning and we're going to pick it up right here, because this passage from Isaiah 2 to chapter 4 deals specifically with their last days. Now look what he says. The word which Isaiah, the son of Amos, saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem. Now it will come about in the last days. Now it's not talking about the last days of the planet, the last days of planet Earth, the last days of time as we know it. No, it's talking about the last days of Israel, the last days of the old covenantal system, that which was prophesied by Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 32. Now Isaiah's picking it up, and we also see Jesus picked it up, as well as Paul and John and James and Peter. They all were saying the same thing. It will come about that in the last days, the mountain of the house of the Lord will be established as chief of the mountains and will be raised above the hills, and all the nations will stream to it. And many peoples will come and say, come, let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of the God of Jacob, that he may teach us concerning his ways, and that we may walk in his paths. For the law will go forth from Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Now listen, this is the Messianic kingdom. The mountain of the house of the Lord is not physical Jerusalem, and it's not the old covenant. This is the universal messianic kingdom in which all the nations are invited to share in the promised salvation. This is the promised kingdom. The mountain of the Lord is the messianic kingdom, the fulfillment of the land promise made to Abraham, the city that has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. Not physical Jerusalem, the heavenly Jerusalem. We'll pick it up in Luke 23, verses 27 to 31. And by the way, it is also referenced in the book of Revelation. Verse 27. And following him was a large crowd of the people and of women who were mourning and lamenting him. But Jesus, turning to them, said, Daughters of Jerusalem, stop weeping for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For behold, the days are coming when they will say, Blessed are the barren and the wombs that never bore and the breasts that never nursed. Now verse 30. Then they will begin to say to the mountains, Fall on us, and to the hills, cover us. For if they do these things when the tree is green, what's going to happen to them when it's dry? Now here's what we need to grasp. This day of judgment, when Messiah, the Lord, will be exalted, was going to occur in the lifetime of those who crucified Jesus. Jesus refers back to these messianic prophecies when he speaks of the coming judgment on Jerusalem and the temple. Now, to ignore this fact is to be completely dishonest with the Scriptures. To ignore the history of the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in 70 AD, this is not debatable. That it happened just exactly as Jesus said it was going to happen, exactly when he said it was going to happen, is to be dishonest with the Scriptures. To minimize the significance of the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple in fulfillment of biblical prophecy is to be dishonest with the Scriptures. Now in Isaiah chapter 3, he continues to describe the judgment that is going to come upon them in their future. And we pick it up in Isaiah 3, verse 8. For Jerusalem has stumbled and Judah has fallen, because their speech and their actions are against the Lord, to rebel against his glorious presence. The expression of their faces bears witness against them, and they display their sin like, well, here we go again. Here's Sodom. He's calling Jerusalem Sodom. They don't even conceal it. In Jeremiah it says they don't even know how to blush. Woe to them, for they have brought evil on themselves. Now say to the righteous, verse 10, that it will go well with them, for they, the righteous, will eat the fruit of their actions. And woe to the wicked, it will go badly with him, for what he deserves will be done to him. Now once again, we see the dual nature of what is going to take place in that day, the day of Messiah. Salvation for the righteous remnant and destruction for the wicked apostates. Now in Isaiah chapter 3, verse 25 and 26, your men will fall by the sword and your mighty ones in battle. And her gates will lament and mourn, and deserted she will sit on the ground. When the Lord, now watch this, verse 4, don't miss this. When the Lord has washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion and purged the bloodshed of Jerusalem from her midst. How? By the spirit of judgment and the spirit of burning. Then the Lord will create over the whole area of Mount Zion and over her assemblies a cloud by day, even smoke and the brightness of a flaming fire by night, for over all the glory will be a canopy. The kingdom is fully realized, fully released at the 70 AD destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, the end of the old covenant era, the old covenantal system. Quote, when the Lord has washed away the filth of the daughters of Zion and purged the bloodshed of Jerusalem from her midst by the spirit of judgment and the spirit of burning. Now, this was a prophecy of what would come about in the Messianic kingdom simultaneous with the end of Old Covenant Israel. And we've covered a lot over the past few weeks. Some things you may have never even considered before. Let me encourage you, don't give up. Don't react. Don't ignore the scriptures. I really do want to thank you for studying with me this morning. If what I'm sharing with you goes against what you've always believed, don't be afraid or intimidated. Study the Word. Go back and review the previous episodes. Build up. They build up each day, builds on the previous day. Wrestle with what the Scriptures have to say. I want to thank you for joining me for Musings of a Texas Preacher Man, and I hope you'll continue to join me Tuesday mornings through Friday mornings each week right here. Why not click on the subscribe button on the lower right corner of your screen, and you'll be notified in YouTube whenever a new video gets posted. And if you're watching on Facebook, consider sharing this on your wall and invite your friends to watch it. And if you saw it on Twitter, retweet it and encourage your friends to watch. And if you live in the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex, why not join me on Tuesday nights at 7 p.m. for Tuesday Nights in the Word? Come on out and join us. Hey, I hope you'll go out and make today a great day.